Culloden, the battle that's memory shall always be stained by blood. A battle which would affect Highland life forever. But while many believe that this was a battle fought between the English and the Scots, or that it was a religious battle between the Catholics and the Protestants, all in all it was a political war, a civil war, a war not for the freedom of the people, but for the House of Stuart to replace the House of Hanover as the British monarchy.
The House of Stuart had been the ruling dynasty in Scotland since 1371, and over the centuries the majority of these monarchs wouldn't really think very highly of the Highlanders and the clansmen's way of life, as the traditions and the customs and beliefs of these people were just so different from the Norman south. Well, King James VI, who had a pretty famous mum with the name of Mary Queen of Scots, you probably heard of her, he was handed the title of King of Scotland and the King of England after the death of Queen Elizabeth I. Well, his son, who's also called James VII of Scotland and 2nd of England, he was born and raised a good wee Protestant lad, do's your told king, no dramas in that. But he converted to Catholicism, which was unthinkable, unbelievable for the wee creeps that were in the Parliament. And the Parliament got together, and 7 of them specifically sent for William of Orange, who was James's cousin, and they invited him to come and invade the kingdom of the Stuarts. James fled to France, and over the next 6 decades there'd be 4 attempts to restore him to his throne. Firstly himself, and then his son, who's also James, was rightfully seen by the French as the King of Scotland, King of England and King of Ireland. But you see, the term Jacobite comes from the Latin, which apparently Jacob is Latin for James, so Jacobite is like the follower of Jacob, the follower of James. These guys, they were the rightful heirs to the Scottish throne and apparently the English throne. But with all this politics going about Europe, with influence from France, Spain, Holy Roman Empire and the Dutch, what the fuck has it got to do with the Highland clansmen? Why have our brothers died and spilled their blood on this field for their cause? Don't ever be fooled into thinking that the Stuarts were humble or honest, patriotic kings. They were fucking scum, mate, committing genocide and mass murders, terrorism over the Highlands for centuries. So why was it that when the bonny Prince Charlie landed into the Scottish lands, onto the lands of the MacDonalds, why did so many clans give their lives for him? Why would men step in line and offer their blood for a man that was not of their own? For a man that was born in Rome? Making up nearly 50% of the Jacobite army on the day of Culloden were the Highland clans. The men that lay in these mounds right before you. Where the pits were dug and the men were buried where they fell. These men were of an ancient tradition, one of kinship, where every man to your left and to your right was your brother, your uncle, your cousin, your blood. And I'm absolutely positive that they had no idea about the grand political situation that was going on in Britain and Europe. But they would fight for their leader, for their father. They'd fight out of honour for their kin, for their clan. But they would also fight out of fear. These men knew that you have to fight for one side. Otherwise all hell will break loose into your family. And you can forget about the future. Because when these men stood on the battlefield, they knew that it might be their last day alive. But they hoped that the future of their children and their children's children and their wives, they hoped that that would be better. So maybe they gave their life not only for out of pride and honour, but maybe they gave their life out of hope. Life was hard. Life's still hard. You have to make your choices in this world. Do you fight? Or do you flee? Do you run away? And accept whatever comes to you. When Charlie first arrived into Scotland, he landed in the MacDonald land on the west coast. And it was obvious to all he was very well educated. With his charm and his confidence, he quickly gathered the support from the Clan Ranald, which quite frankly just loved a scrap, let's be honest. Well, when his standard was raised on August the 19th in Glenfinnan, he was joined by 800 Camerons, whose clan chief had been persuaded with the promise of French aid. Over the next 7 months, the Jacobites would defeat the Redcoats on several occasions and even head an attempted invasion of England. On April the 14th, Prince Charlie would find himself here in Inverness, while his cousin and bitter rival would be at the head of a 9,000 man Redcoat army just 15 miles away to the east in Nairn. Charlie had the option to retreat, as his warriors were spread all over the Highlands, all the way from Fort William all the way up to Sutherland. He could have retreated and tried to gather more men, but instead word was sent out. It was time for the clansmen to gather. As the word quickly spread that the clansmen had to assemble in time for battle, many of the local men of Strathnairn and Clan Hatton assembled here, at the ancient gathering place of the Stone of Swords, or Clach na Aram. Many of these men were cousins, distant relatives. Some of them had not seen each other for a long time. Fortunately, we've been left a tale by a man who spent the evening there with his family. Now he can do a much better job of explaining to you than what I can.
Picture the scene. It's early morning on Tuesday the 15th of April 1746. All around is a babble of sound. There are people here, a lot of people. All are speaking the Gaelic language of their ancestors. There's a feeling of anticipation that something very important is soon about to take place. Alongside the voices, there's a continuous sound of metal scraping on the stone, as men are lining up to sharpen their swords and their dirks in preparation for war. It's a colourful scene this morning. There are hundreds of men gathering together, dressed in the tartan garb of their forebearers. The colours are those of various dyes derived from vegetation grown wild in their neighbourhood. A few of the people present are obviously men of some standing in their community. It's easy to tell, as they are the ones wearing fine jackets, continental shirts with lace trim and expensive decorative footwear. The great majority of people here are not well dressed, however. They are clothed in a simple but uniform attire. The long woolen plaid, a coarse homespun shirt, and the distinctively Highland bonnet. The lucky ones have shoes. Many are simply barefoot. Irrespective of whether these clansmen are rich or poor, they share a common bond, one of kinship. They know their genealogies inside out. Some are here out of determination to see Prince Charles Edward Stuart claim the throne of Great Britain once again for the Stuart dynasty. But most people are here because they have to be. They would rather be tending their sheep, their cattle and their families, but refusal to turn up for battle would result in their thatched roofs being burnt and their cattle being confiscated by the landowning superiors. The people gathered here are not men of any regulation, military age. Some are well on in their years, having seen action as young men in the 1715 Jacobite rebellion. Their knowledge and experience will be invaluable over the next few days. Others are young, very young. Mere boys even, barely in their teens. Highlanders are natural soldiers, highly effective in warfare, armed for both distant and close combat, exceptionally mobile, and in their own territory almost invincible. They will fight not only for their leader, but most of all for their brothers, their fathers, their sons, cousins and uncles who stand alongside them in the affray. They will fight furiously and passionately, not just for their own pride, but for the protection and honour of their kin. The might of the British Army fears the Highland warrior more than any other that they've ever done battle with. There's a restlessness amongst the gathering. Men form roughly into groups behind their leaders. and head towards an area of open ground somewhere in the south of Inverness. We will reinforce a Jacobite army that has endured 7 long months of warfare across mainland Britain, fighting and winning 2 major battles during the time. The Highland soldiers waiting in Culloden Moor are cold, tired and hungry, in no fit state to fight. The long hard winter has taken its toll on them. Our men are fresh, well fed and rested. They are well prepared for military action. The finest infantry in the British Army will greet the men of Clan Hatton with great fear.
When the men finally arrived here in Culloden, they were sent on a night march to Nairn, as Charlie figured that his best way to defeat the Redcoats would be a surprise attack during the night. And it just so happened to be the Duke of Cumberland's birthday, so he figured the boys, might have a wee bevy and a wee party and probably no fit state for battle. Well, it was a moonless night and it would end up horrendous. People getting lost along the way, and by 2 AM they still hadn't reached Nairn. So the men were ordered to come back to Culloden. Can you imagine? 7 AM, you haven't eaten in days. You just walked 15 miles there, 15 miles back. The rain was coming, the snow, the sleet, it was horrendous. These men were shattered. They wrapped themselves up in their plaids and they tried to get a wee kip. Just 4 hours later, at 11 AM, the alarm was sounded. The Redcoats were making their way up the moor. The Redcoats, the Hanoverians, the government troops. These were not English, these were Highlanders, Lowlanders, Englishmen, Welshmen, Europeans. These were the men that were fighting for the British Army. Well trained, experienced, soldiers that were prepared for any battle.
The men had to move fast and rise into order. The front line would comprise of the Athelmen, Camerons, Appin Stewarts, Macphersons, Frasers, Macintoshes, Farquharsons, MacLeods, MacLeans, Clanranald, Keppoch, Glengarry. On either flank were placed 2 guns, with a 5th and 6th in the centre. The second line would form Lord Ogilvy's men, Lord Lewis Gordon's, Duke of Perth regiments, and the Irish and French pickets.
The Redcoats were ordered forward to the position of the red flags, and the Jacobites to the position of the blue flags. The clansmen were some of the most exceptional warriors around, but in hand-to-hand combat. And they kind of made a custom and a tradition, and the Highland charge had become their staple, where they would charge down their enemy, shrieking and screaming to cause fear into their opponents. But here in Culloden Moor, not even a deer can run. It's an incredible bogland with half of it's like a swamp. It's absolutely brutal to run through. So the men, they were never going to gain the traction that they needed in order for their charge to really make effect. And the clansmen knew this, and the chiefs knew this. And they let Charlie know. But it was too late. At around 1 PM, Charlie would order the first shots to be fired from roughly this location on the south side of the battlefield. The shots would have little effect on the Hanoverian troops, and of course they would retaliate and they returned fire, which had a devastating effect on the clansmen. And one by one, their brothers were falling amongst them. They were like sitting ducks, but yet the call to charge was never made. The men became restless, seeing their brothers fall amongst them. The Macintoshes were the first ones to break rank as they were shrieking as they were charging down their enemies. Bear in mind, they're on the other side. They were also clansmen. They were also Highlanders. There were brothers on both sides. There was the story of a father who would face his son. And if he didn't face his son in battle, and someone else would kill his son, and his house get set on fire and his cattle stolen. These men had no option. The other clans quickly followed the Macintoshes, charging down, shrieking at their enemy, ready for battle. Facing musket shots, grape shots, cannons. It was absolutely brutal. The men were running to what seemed an almost certain death. Clansmen continued to charge through the fire, and men to their left and their right were falling. Their brothers, their uncles, their fathers, they were dying right beside them. But they kept going and they smashed through the government line. These government troops, the Hanoverians, were well trained, and they'd been drilled in this technique of shooting to the right instead of shooting to the front, which was apparently super effective, and the Highland clansmen had no idea what this even was. This technique was completely new to them. So the men that made it to the front, all of a sudden, they found themselves being surrounded by three sides, being bayoneted and shot. They quickly realised that they had no opportunity to win and they had to retreat. So the men turned their backs and started running back to the Jacobite line. But many of these men were shot on the way.
The ice on my bones turned to stone in my belly. We made a brave attempt, all the MacDonalds, but so much went wrong. The order to charge came too late, and the ground stopped us building the power needed to smash through the redcoat ranks. All we could do was come close and try to tempt them into action. We tried this attempt 3 times, but with no avail. And then the right and the centre retired in full flight, and all we could do was follow them because our right flank was open to fire. Donald Roy MacDonald saw my father caught in the deadly grape shot and fallen. He found the strength to shout out, "Donald, have mercy upon me. Donald, do the best for yourself, for I am gone." So Donald ran on. James MacDonald, a captain like me, came upon my father, and seeing that it was only his arm that was shattered, he helped him up. But they struggled back, and a second shot hit Keppoch in the back, and he fell again. James checked for life, seeing none, so he left him. I was next to pass, and felt my heart about to break when I saw him. But he wasn't gone. Me and my companions lifted him up, and tried to get to the clear of the field. We'll dress his wounds and then get him home. But by the time we lay him down, he was already dead, for I would now have to lead the clan. I acted as my father would have wished, saving such of our people as I could from the field of death. I took his sword and dirk home, and hid them near the Keppoch house. Sometimes in my mind I see the boulder marking the place of my father's fall, and I think, take this burden back. I only want he who has gone to be restored to us.
The clansmen that survived would return to where they started and reform the front rank with Charlie and the lairds and the French and the Irish piquettes behind them. The men would regroup and the call to charge would be made. Believe it or not, these men, just having seen half of their families completely slaughtered on the battlefield, these men would have the balls to recharge and run at the enemy. But about halfway up, they quickly realised that this was pure insane, mate. This was crazy. This was just a certain death. And they decided to retreat, turning their back and fleeing for their lives. It was said that Charlie would not accept defeat, and he had to be persuaded to leave, even to save his own life. The Redcoats were ordered to chase down the fleeing Jacobites and kill every man they seen in sight. It was said that the road to Inverness was red with blood, with the bodies of the dead men trailed along the road all the way. The story of Culloden is so much deeper than just a 1-hour battle story. All in all, it'd be about 1,500 men killed on the battlefield, and an estimated 3,500 to 5,000 men, children and women all arrested for their crimes by supporting the Jacobite cause, for supporting their family, their clan, their chief. The significance of Culloden, however, still lies deep in the blood of every Scot today, and if it doesn't, then I advise you to educate yourself. Because after Culloden, the government would impose restrictions which would see our language being banned, which would see the colours of our tartan being banned, where we couldn't even wear our kilts anymore. And eventually, they would even take the land of our ancestors off us and hand it to the rich, or the sheep. I feel my ancestors when I come to Culloden. I feel them every day. I know they're with me. But we allow them to die in vain by forgetting about them. Or by giving so much respect to Charlie. Who is Charlie? Who is Prince Charlie? Before you call yourself a Jacobite, I ask you to learn who Prince Charlie was. Wasn't he bonny, mate? He was a wee prick. My clan, my family, my brother, my sister, my nieces, my nephews. Woof. You better be fast, 'cause I'll come at you, mate. I will come at you.